You have to be awake to open yourself up to the greatest possibilities.
What is on offer from a place of quiet versus what is on offer from a place of noise.
If you're a leader in business, if you're a leader in any walk of life, and thinking, how do I combine this with building an incredible organization and achieving remarkable things in service of the world?
If you want to build a culture of high performers, bold innovators, start with waking people up.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Live Into Your Brilliance, the place where we go deep and explore to look for the experiments and the insights that can help us see the truth of who we are and live lives we love right now. I'm joined, as always, by my brother from another mother, who's in one of our favorite spots in New Hampshire, where we host our Live Into Your Brilliance Founders gatherings, and Bilos has been flying solo, doing a little gathering of his own. So how you doing, my man? How's the energy after your couple of days?
I'm exhausted and energized, if that makes sense. I've just had the leadership team from a company called Zelo, who both the founders have actually been on separate founder retreats with us. One came to the Wales one, and one came to the New Hampshire one, our very first one. So it was great to see Sam and Barney again and hang out with them and Sam's leadership team. So I had 7 executives here for 48 hours and treated them to a South African potjie and facilitated some really good discussions around human wiring and how we are made, and how as leaders, armed with that knowledge, we get to show up differently if we choose to. Um, and and then also diving into their customer value framework and their strategy and their system for how they operate. So it was a lot of ground covered and lots of fun as well. Like really, really great engagement, great people, and feel very blessed. And it's a beautiful day here in New Hampshire. The sun is out. It's a little chilly. The lake is not frozen over, and couldn't be happier, my friend.
Nice. Well, that sounds amazing. I'm jealous of the weather. In Manchester today, we've had hailstones and flooding, and like all the roads around the house are closed,
Oh
and
my
so
word.
it's been slightly different here. But anyway, I'm sure in a couple of days it will all subside. Um, we chatted just off air, and I think your introduction or sharing what you've been doing with the Zelo guys is maybe the perfect launch point for what would be a cool discussion today. Because in the work that I'm doing in my role in Jewel and the work that you've been doing with Zelo, like even there's that combination, and I'm going to kind of, I guess my question, there's a combination of spiritual awareness. So whether you want to call it spiritual awareness or like awareness around like how we are wired and built perfectly as human beings, and then systems awareness and best practice, and like what, like in the game of business, and whether you call it the game of business or the game of leadership. And it strikes me that those two things can play off very nicely with each other. They can be very complementary, or in one sense, it can look like they're butting heads, where one is in competition with the other almost. And so I'd love to explore where we see the intersection between human wiring and the game of business, and what's on offer there, and what does it look like when one is potentially getting in the way of the other. And I think it can work both ways. Like that's my hypothesis. I think you can have people who are too much in the camp of no, like it's all just about being awake spiritually. And if that's true, you don't have to worry about anything else, and can almost be dismissive of um, organizational best practice and the game of business. And at the same time, I think people in business who are very much locked into the idea of, look, no, this is completely different. This is all about like this is all about business and best practice, and are quite dismissive of the uh, the more innate qualities of human beings and our innate wisdom, let's say, and they might disregard that as woo woo, and therefore they never get the multiplier effect of seeing how they can be complementary. So that's what I'd love to put on the table. I don't I don't have, like we always say, we don't have answers, and I definitely don't have an answer on this one because I just see it as I see it as this interesting space at the minute in my work and in working with clients over the years, how those two things can seem a little bit like they're in opposition with each other.
Well, I think to frame this conversation, there are three examples that we can pull on. And it's funny, I'm actually, like, tomorrow I'm flying out with a bunch of friends. This mate Trevor, who hopefully will get on the podcast one day soon, who started this phenomenal business in Boston called Blue Wave Solar and sold it to private equity, and has recently stepped away as CEO and is enjoying some downtime and exploring some really interesting stuff. And another mate, James, um, and we're going to this place called Bandon Dunes. And Bandon Dunes is this phenomenal uh, golf course on the coast of Oregon, built right on the dunes, like 100 feet above the beach. And if anybody's been to the Oregon coast, you'll know it's like wild, 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 wild. And I mean, there were storms that came through there in the 1850s, I believe, that were just like washed entire chunks of land away forever, like killed the gold rush dead because it just washed all the volcanic black soil full of gold away. Um, but I was reading this book. Sorry, not reading. I'm listening to a book about the guy who founded Bandon Dunes, and this guy called Mike Kaiser. And it's really fascinating because Mike, by his own right, was or is a super successful guy. Um, I think he's still alive. I'll have to Google it. But anyway, he started a gift card company called RPG, like recycled paper goods. And they made these irreverent gift cards that were funny and sort of witty and what have you. And they built up this business. Two guys, Mike and his mate, and they were wildly and are wildly successful. And as a result of you know being able to kind of direct this thing as a private company, you know, he was able to like show up the way he wanted. And apparently, if you went into the office, him and his co-founder still share an office. Co-founder's super messy. Mike's like super tidy. Um, Mike wears uh, casual gear, but always looks very elegant, but just wears casual gear and is maniacally focused on execution and but loves, like, avoids like formal meetings but loves brainstorming sessions, and just ran this incredibly successful business. And private equity was approaching them and saying, like, sell to us, sell to us, sell to us, you can make more money, you can expand, blah blah blah. And he didn't. And anyway, during the course of his life, he bought some land to avoid a developer ruining his little uh, lakeside spot in Illinois. And then he and his family just started mucking around on this large tract of land with golf clubs, and they'd play like bush golf. And then one day he said to a mate of his, "Hey, I want you to go and find me a million acres. It's got to be on dunes. Um, so we want to emulate some of the greatest links courses in the world, the Irish and the Scottish in particular. We want Mother Nature to be the chief architect, and we're going to build something phenomenal." And so I haven't finished the book, but I know how it ends. They built Bandon Dunes, and they're in Oregon near the little town of Bandon. And the joke is, what's the famous Irish links course? Is it Ballydoon?
Ballybunion,
Ballybunion.
Ballybuffet,
Ballybunion. Thank
Ballybunion.
you. And the joke is, what's the difference between Ballybunion and Bandon Dunes? It's easier to get to Ballybunion because Bandon Dunes is in the middle of nowhere. And he's built 7 courses there. So there's the Bandon Dunes course, the Pacific Dunes course, there's the Shepherd's course, there's the McDonald course. And he's built 7 like world-class golf courses in this area. And he wanted to make it affordable to the public, open to the public, and accessible for the sheer joy of playing golf, but playing golf on courses shaped by Mother Nature, not by bulldozers and what have you. So it's a proper links type experience where you might hit the greatest shot in the world, but if there's Mother Nature put a little divot there, like, and your ball shoots off into the ocean, like, tough luck, mate. Like, that's just the way the game
Hmm.
goes. Anyway, so here is a guy who was able to start a business, direct a business, shape a business, bring his values to the business, but still like make time for what was important to him, and that was his family and his growing obsession with golf. And then he built something phenomenal, and he built something in service of the world where he said, I want to build something that will be around in 500 years time that people will enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so wildly successful. Like, you don't like, to build this whole thing was like $40 million, and so you got to still have $40 million. He paid cash for everything. And then you think of a guy like Yvon Chouinard from Patagonia, who built a privately held company that could ignore Wall Street entirely, and he could design his own operating system from scratch. He could bring his own kind of philosophical foundation. He was like, he was able to bring his values as a competitive advantage. Um, they then, in 2022, they transferred the whole ownership and structure of this thing into like a sort of a non-profit or trust specifically designed to fight climate change. And everybody loves it. I mean, Patagucci is what all the kids wear. It's what all the adults wear in their sports gear. And so there was this blend of philosophical foundation, being awake, building a business, bringing your values, and changing the world. And then the final example in my book would be a public company, and it's Microsoft. And I know everybody talks about Satya Nadella and like what amazing transformation he's done, but like, his son Zane was was a has cerebral palsy, so it like gave him a very different sense of empathy and perspective. He inherited this kind of know-it-all, culture from Bill Gates and Balmer, which, Balmer was a very kind of toxic human being, I guess, or toxic leader, where it was super aggressive, and Microsoft was really seen as a bit of a dinosaur because it had missed the whole mobile phone thingy. Like, that whole story is well known. But then he built his philosophy and his curiosity to learn it all. He got his strategic alignment right with his competitors like Apple and Linux and what have you. Um, he's grown the company like 10x, but he's also spoken quite openly about his personal boundaries. And he said, "I like to get home at a reasonable hour, be present for my family." Um, and he's also like, but he's very like open. He's like, leadership is hard. It's demanding. But it's not about working 20 hours versus 40. It's about being intentional with your time and your energy. And so I just, and so I think when I think about the work that I'm doing with like a Zelo or any of the founders that come to our retreat, my hope is that by pointing to some of the stuff we do about how we are wired, you can blend your philosophical foundation, your understanding of human wiring. You can blend that with the urgency that ships with growing and business and fulfilling all the stakeholder demands, and the operating system for getting that done, and the balance you must strike if you want to be a decent father, decent husband, decent wife, partner, whatever, decent friend, and also just a good human being who is out there as a responsible member of society. And I think that is on offer. But I think a lot of people tell themselves stories and spin narratives to defend and make excuses for why they didn't get it right.
Well, even though there's no such thing as getting it right, but I'm just been, I'm pulling your leg. Well, I'm sort of pulling your leg, and I'm sort of not. Um, because what do you mean by that? Just to pull that one. So when you say, because there's an interesting place just for you to end on that one, which is people will tell themselves stories as to how they didn't get it right. What do you mean by that?
I think there are people, and we know these people, who would say, yeah, you are full of shit. Like, all that foo-foo stuff, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you fucking, like, you have a clear vision and you work hard and you kill yourself and you get the job done. And you've got to get lucky along the way. And 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 the fact that they might have a dysfunctional relationship with their loved one or their friends or their body, you know, you think of, like, I mean, the classic example is you think of poor old Steve Jobs, but I mean, I don't want to go down that rat hole. But, you know, alcohol, like, you and I know plenty of people who have a very unnatural, unhealthy sort of relationship with alcohol because that's their scaffolding and their excuse, um, and their coping mechanism for how hard they are working and the energy they're putting out in order to, you know, do this for the family or do this for themselves or do this for their employees or what have you. And I'm not saying it's wrong, like, each to their own, and everybody sees what they're going to see. But what I'm pointing to is don't stand in front of me and tell me that being awake doesn't matter when it comes to running a business, because it 100% does. And I think there are more examples of awake people doing phenomenal stuff than fast asleep people doing phenomenal stuff.
Well, like I can hear your passion. If I was to poke the bear, I'd be like, it definitely sounds like there's a part of you that's going, no, I think there's a wrong way in there. And I think there's a right way. So I'm just gonna call that out a little bit.
Well,
Because
I guess that's true because I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I thought it wasn't the right way to do it.
well, yeah, like I don't know. It's just interesting. Like I'm gonna come at it from a slightly different angle because and I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with anything that you said. Like there's lots in there that I think is fascinating. Um, you know, because the first one, I don't know what that person is like outside of I don't know whether who was the guy that what was the name of
Mike
the
Kaiser.
golf.
Mike Kaiser.
Yeah, I don't know what his what sacrifices he might have made or not, or whether he has a super functional family or any of that stuff. And but the bit that I'm more interested in is not like is is there a right or a wrong way? And I know that's not really what you're pointing to either. The question that I'm most interested in is like, where's the intersection? Like, what is it that, like, if you can start to see how these two things blend? And I mean that, like, in terms of like the woo woo side, which that's what I was pointing at. Some people will dismiss that. And we know lots of people that dismiss that. I also know a whole bunch of people who are, in theory, awake, who dismiss all the other stuff,
Right.
who will be like, yeah, yeah, no, you don't need any of that stuff. Like, you just have
Go
to
live
be
off the
awake and
land.
trust and just show up. Just show up and just trust in people and they kind of are dismissive of some of the more practical elements of like great leadership, great business building, because whether you talk about Microsoft, Patagonia, or um, uh, what was it, RPG,
Mm,
um, there had to have been amazing like business building gone on because you don't create organizations like that without figuring out lots of best practices and understanding those two things and so I that's what's become fascinating to me. It's like, oh, okay, where's the intersection of those? What happens when you lean too far in one direction or the other? And
mm,
I was chatting to Chris Shambrook, who we had on here before just the other day about this, and he was saying, yeah, like we've got at Jewel, we have um, a, a cultural standard, which we call, and it's our kind of slogan for our culture that we're all like in service of, which is to have a high trust, tight ship full of bloody brilliant and utterly lovely people with the freedom to do their best work together. And I was chatting to Chris about that, and he was like, "Oh yeah, it's such a great statement because you've got the paradoxes in there."
mm,
And one of the things we're talking about is like a tight ship and freedom look like again like that, like ooh, where's the blend between those two things? And I was because he said if you're not careful, you end up with everyone in rowing in a boat, but all pulling at different paces, and so you're expending lots of energy to have a very slow boat.
mm,
And it was like this. It's about becoming really conscious of where these things marry up.
mm,
Like it becomes a conscious act,
mm,
and so that's where I'm like starting to become really interested in, as to, huh. So what does it look like, for example, to implement a great operating system or to really live your values in the company, but at the same time have a tight ship and then be an awake human being whilst you're doing it, but at the same time, let's say have a great performance culture and full of awake people. It becomes an interesting thing. And what are the traditional practices that maybe get in the way of just the innate brilliance of human beings, and what are the brilliant business practices that sometimes get thrown out, like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because people go, no, 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 no. Like, if you just trust in the human spirit, you don't need any of that. And it's like, I'm not so sure that's true. Like, I'm a big believer in operating systems, and I'm more and more like, no, you have to have a kick ass operating system. Once you get beyond a certain point in organizational growth, you really need to become systematic in how you think. So you need to start putting in an operating system. And this is one of the areas that I'm thinking does have the balance. It's like, how do you build an operating system that creates space, that has the human wiring designed into it, versus an operating system that assumes that that is bullshit. And it's the I was on a call this morning with a wonderful lady called Jodie Spate from the Culture Code, and she was talking about change. And as she went through this, and she called them change adventures, it was a remarkable session, actually. And even the fact she called it change adventures, she just said, like, why don't we just make it like something that people want to be part of? And as she went through it, it was all about going, yeah, you just have to take the time to give people the space to connect and to get fueled up and fired up for the adventure they want to go on. And as she went through it, I was like, oh my God, yeah, like you can manage change by creating the space for people's brilliance to shine. But then she was like, but you put just enough structure around it. You have to use your artifacts. Like, you need to have a system, because otherwise it becomes chaotic. Otherwise people don't know what to do. Otherwise it never gets embedded. Which is like, but equally, if you just try and drive change through, you might get it done, but no one will give a shit, and it probably won't really have the impact that you want, because you're not allowing the space for human beings to do what they naturally want to do, which is to get involved and to co-create with each other. And when they do that, the results are spectacular. And so when I think about your examples like Satya Nadella and the Patagonia founder, and whose name I always struggle to say, so that's why I just call him the
Yvonne
Patagonia founder.
Chenard. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So I'll just go with Patagonia founder, and you can say his name. Um, I think there's something that they have mastered, and that's what I'm pointing at. There's something that they've mastered, which is this intersection. Because I remember reading a story in Satya Nadella's book where he was talking about being on some big global call and about something, and someone on the call said, well, like, it's really hard to get approvals for blah 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 blah. And he just cut straight through and was like, listen, if you know it's the right thing to do, then you can just get it done. Like, in this company, you can just get it done. And and I thought, and I remember thinking, oh wow, like, within that, he's still inviting people to trust the wisdom. So there's clearly systems and setups and processes, but at the same time, he's speaking to that, like, hey, if you know and you just act from that place, we're going to win. We're going to win more than we lose.
The interesting thing for me, mate, is, and I don't know, I don't always articulate this particularly well, and so, and sometimes I I do actually, I think, I believe there is a right and a wrong way, which I know, like, that's just an illusion. But going back to my comment about why do I spend my time facilitating these sessions the way I do, is because I fundamentally believe that what you and I talk about a lot is practice. And practice requires a shit ton of discipline, like a lot of discipline. So even if you're foo foo and you believe that, hey man, just surrender it up to the universe and just show up and it'll be all cool, like life will take care of itself. a lot of that might be true, but whether you accept it or not, like you've probably adopted a high degree of discipline to be at a level of peace and acceptance and quiet that you purport to be at. Now, I don't know, like, if that person is at peace or not, but I know for me personally, I I work at my peace. I work hard at the practice of observing and experimenting and and making the choices between stimulus and response. And sometimes I forget and I completely drop the ball. And then I notice and I laugh and I call myself silly sausage, like our friend Woody. And then I go again. But that's a discipline. That's a system. And running a business effectively is no different. And I've always claimed that discipline equals freedom. And I was saying that long before I even got into the curiosity of human wiring. I was saying that at Mimecast, where I was driving an operating system as chief of staff, because I fundamentally believe that discipline equals freedom. And so if you have, and I'm not saying you need a all singing, all dancing, like, you know, white hall for how you run your business. But if you have just enough structure and you're super clear about your customer value framework and you're super clear about the strategy you need to bring that into the world and you're super clear about how your strategy bridges into execution and you're super clear about how you want people to show up in the business and you map that out on a one pager, three pager, I don't really give a shit, but you should be able to articulate your strategic framework on one page, I believe. um, then you have a then you have the license to do phenomenal stuff. And in the words of our friend Penny Finney, you can become the hands of the universe because you have clarity and you have freedom because you're not running around like a headless chicken. You're laser focused and you can bring your innovation and your creativity to solving that problem with a capital P, which is your reason for existing in the universe as a business. And so I think there's an interesting blend between the practice of being awake and the discipline of that, and the practice of having an operating system which creates the discipline which affords the freedom. And I think those two things go hand in hand. I fundamentally believe that.
Well, so I think you're right. That's what I'm pointing to. So I'm in agreement with you that those two things can go hand in hand. More often than not, they don't go hand in hand. That's what I'm pointing to. Like, more often than not, like I I love the discipline equals freedom, and I think that's a truism that has a lot of depth to it, actually, in many different areas. By having your strategy on one page, by having all clarity in all those things, you know, your strategy, how your strategy translates into execution, how you want to show up, everything you listed there. I don't believe that that is what creates the opportunity for you to be the hands of the universe. That's where I think within that, what I'm interested in, and I don't know like I'm literally just because within that, and this is where I think why you do what you do with Zelo, why we do it with founders. It's like to go more often than not, the human wiring piece is not woven into these things. It's not woven into business strategy. It's not woven into execution. It's not even really woven into values and behaviors. It's different. Like they are kind of they are the levers that people go, no, like if we just get this right and then we drive it and we execute. And that is what I think leads to the place where you are pointing to, which is that for a lot of people, why do they end up in scenarios where success feels like suffering, where like they can win at one part of life, but then they realize that, you know, potentially something else suffers. And, you know, and there's some place in there that I think, and for me, at the minute, what I'm seeing is, and I think it's in your piece, but it comes back to the, like if everyone knew the, if everyone really understood and it was, huh, what how much less organizational structure and protocols and everything would you need if you were able to design those things with a true knowing around the innate brilliance of every single human being. Um, but and what level of education and awareness building would you need to awaken that in everyone in your organization? And it's a very, I'm not sure we're going to answer it in this one. It's a very interesting like dance that happens between those two things. Like if Satya Nadella was here, and I'm interested in your perspective on this because actually I listened to a podcast with Steve Ballmer the other day, and super interesting because I was like, oh, it created a quite different perception in my mind as to like what he is. I was like, oh, that's so fascinating to listen to. Um, but one of my questions in my mind is, do you require, or how much is it a requirement that the leader of the business has an intention to weave these things together? Do you think that like Microsoft and Patagonia and RPG are the examples that you point to are a function of the awakeness of those leaders? And do you think it would have been possible for Microsoft to weave these two things together with Steve Ballmer at the helm?
No,
Right.
it's got everything to do with the human being that shows up and they come from. Like, just think of our Mimecast experience. Like, you and I joked, and we've joked with Pete. Like, Pete might have been the most awake person out of all of us. The way he showed up and didn't change and was the same irreverent, mischievous person. And everybody in Mimecast, there wasn't one person in Mimecast who didn't enjoy and respect him for how he showed up. Now, did he get everything right? No. And he's the first to admit it. Was he wildly successful? Yeah, he was. But it started with him, and he had the presence of mind to surround himself with some pretty phenomenal humans. And he knew enough and had enough awareness to hand certain things over and hold on to other things. And I think great leaders do that. But I think Pete would also be the first person to put his hand up and go, "Yeah, look, I didn't get it all right. Um, I probably could have spent more time at home with the family or with my friends or whatever. Maybe I didn't have a healthy regard for my body at times, or like but getting it wrong is not getting it wrong. We're meant to get it wrong. It's what we see from that place, and awake people see it, and and are and love themselves enough and love others enough to correct it. I think unawake people don't see it. They just tell themselves stories, and then there's a cost, right? There's a cost. That's how I'm going to phrase it. There's a cost to not being awake as a leader. There's a personal cost, and there's a cost to what you put out into the world.
I agree with that in both the micro and the macro sense for all of us. Like there's a cost to not being awake, and it's why, like, remembering, you get to see the mess that you might have just made, and then you can either go and clean it up or not. And then on the macro level, I was just thinking about Elon Musk popped into my head, and you can actually see the cost it has on him. Now I don't know
Yeah,
Elon Musk, so but I'm just doing uh, like my own little comparison and going, oh yeah, if I was to compare Elon Musk with Satya Nadella, you'd go, uh, I can see who's probably more awake to their innate human brilliance, and and the other person who's not, and yet they're both wildly successful. Like Elon Musk is arguably the most successful human being that's ever lived in one regard right now. In one, if you took it in one just like commercial sense. Um, do you know what's interesting about Pete as well? And I do hope we'll get him on here at some point. Is his martial arts background, and I do wonder if like that kind of, you know, Zen approach and that like mindfulness and that thoughtfulness was his gateway into always being kind of very
definitely.
an- anchored into the self, not into the me, but into the I. And he would never talk about it in that way. And for those that people that don't know, like we call this live into your brilliance, and Pete calls it slip into your silliness. So like you can tell just how much how he's prepared to poke fun at myself and Bilos. But what I think is emerging for me in this conversation as well, and it's that word practice, but it's also the other word curiosity. Like there's all these words merging, but I think it's a non-trivial um, lifelong experiment, or forever long you're in it, to see where the opportunity is to bring these two things together.
Mm.
I think that is what's, and I don't know, actually I don't really know that there's a lot of, I guess I'd probably put Brené Brown as someone who I think is the closest to it in my mind, just as a thought leader who's trying to bring these two things together and saying like you can actually combine them very
Mm.
purposefully. Maybe you could talk about some other folks, but you have to be deeply curious in both, on both lenses. Like that's the opportunity. If I took like Sam and Barney, Zelo founders, amazing guys, they now well, I'm sure they always have been, but like they're clearly deeply curious to explore, huh, what's there, and then they're obviously deeply curious to explore what's over here in the world of like, but how do we, like, what are the practices, like where are the opportunities to learn what a great business looks like, and what's it look like to tap into the human wiring that's on offer, and how do we merge these two things together, and how do we create the space for them? Um,
But I think the more leaders, whether they do it consciously or not, the more leaders slip into the self rather than the ego, the me. The more they spend time in the I, because their son has cerebral palsy and they just have a perspective and an inner calm and a different view, or they've been on a retreat and they've spent time with you and me, or they um they had the benefit of, I don't know, listening to an Alan Watts YouTube clip, and they got curious. Like however it happens, or however they do it, and some people maybe just do it more naturally than others. I think those leaders see what what is on offer from a place of quiet versus what is on offer from a place of noise. And I would say, like, a Satya and a Yvonne and Mike Kaiser and other people who are deeply in service of something far bigger than themselves are are doing what they're doing with the seeming grace and quiet and confidence, because they understand fundamentally that anything is from offer from that place of quiet. And when I think you're operating from a place of resistance and noise and ego, you can't you you subscribe to a lot of your own stories and you read your own headlines, and that's great. Like, that makes you feel good, but you're probably terrified of the quiet, because because it's not comfortable. I don't think it's comfortable. I would go so far as to say, like, Steve Jobs was not a comfortable human being. Elon Musk is not a comfortable human being. Bill Gates is probably becoming more comfortable, but there were probably times when Bill Gates just wasn't a comfortable human being. He didn't have a lot of peace and quiet, you know. And and that's, I mean, who knows if I'm right or wrong, but I see leaders who get this and are curious about it and the way they show up, and I see leaders who dismiss this and the way they show up. And fuck me, I would not work for those people. They actually make me anxious.
Or like there's a like that's there. I think you're like that last sentence makes my. It's why I'm so curious about this, because that's the downside of being dismissive of human wiring. Is you make a whole section of people just like anxious because you're a noise creator rather than an awakener. You're a noise maker rather than an awakener, which I've never thought about with that. But you can be one or the other. Like you can actually just create noise for people, or you can awaken them. And and interestingly enough, if you're not interested enough to look in the other direction, if you are someone who like, and actually, I think if you dismiss human wiring, like, chances are you're probably not really awake to the possibility there, and you create noise. And I think someone who claims to be awake and dismisses and is not willing to get deeply curious about, like, the world of business and kind of and and what's on offer there, I think they also are probably not as awake as they think they are, and b are noisemakers in their own right, because to dismiss one or the other becomes to dismiss anything one or the other to dismiss anything like that means that you have to have a blind spot. You have to have a blind spot as soon as you said, no, woo woo stuff, or no, 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 like, that's not the right way. um but the opportunity the opportunity is massive. That's what I see in this, is the opportunity is massive. And when we see people, and like, I can imagine who you might be talking about, because it's more specific, I think, to get into the people that you actually know close hand. um when we notice the people who are awake and who are achieving a level of success in work and outside of work, whatever way it might be, it often looks fascinating. And um, and I think it's I think it's a topic that actually we have probably underexplored in one regard. Is this like how like where do you combine them? Like where are the elements that you could practically architect into your business or into your working life, which is like this is an experiment that you can run. Like I think we might want to run a series of these and look at things like an operating model, like an operating system. Like what does an operating system look like for a business that has human wiring at the heart of it? You know, what are the challenges that what are the challenges that are going to come up that are going to challenge people to stay open-handed and open-minded versus getting closed-fisted and closed-minded. You know, what are the new pathways that have to be carved where you go like this is how you've got to carve into your business a whole new set of like understandings such that people go, oh wow, this is true. You know, how do you show up as a leader then in service of that and go, okay, so what's my role as a leader? You know, if someone says, well, how would I architect an operating system if I'm the CEO founder, or if I'm a chief of staff, or if I'm a COO, or whatever it might be, and it's saying like, how do I architect this in a way that gives it the opportunity to thrive? Then how do I educate people so that we can all show up to their best, to give it the best possibility? And how do I show up to be able to do that? Like what's incumbent on me? Because as with everything, you know, your Steve Ballmer, Satya Nadella comparison, it's exactly right. It's like, well, it only works if you can show up from that place. Like you can, that's what I really meant. Like you can have all the strategies and the stuff are really valuable, not to be dismissed. And their power lies in are they designed with this in mind or without this in mind? And do you show up to them from this place or do you show up to them from this place? And and that is to me that is a huge opportunity, um, and it requires more exploration. It requires more exploration because in my view there is real practical stuff that like I know that you know, like I know that you put them into practice. So I know at the Zelo guys you'll be going like, let's map your customer journey. Let's look at these things. Like you have to have these things and you have to have these. I guess what I'm pointing at is often we don't just actually get very specific about look, this is how these things overlap. This is what it can look like. Um, and and it just it's bringing a curiosity to that in this podcast as much as anything else for our listeners to say if you're interested in this then you've got to have a mindset which is explore if you're a leader in business, if you're a leader in any walk of life and thinking how do I combine this with building an incredible organization and achieving remarkable things in service of the world, well then you're going to have to get deeply curious about both and you're going to have to run experiments and you're going to have to be willing to kind of um, you're going to have to be willing to run up against the status quo because this is not common practice. I don't think it is common practice.
Yeah, and you know, at Mimecast, we used to talk about doing your best work, your best teamwork, and your greatest learning.
Yeah.
And you, I believe you can only do that if you're awake.
Wow. That's a I'm not disagreeing with on that. I wonder about if we were to reflect back, then I would put it, did we ever do our did we really achieve those three things?
I think at times we did, because I think we were
Yeah.
awake without even knowing we were awake.
Mm.
And at times we failed miserably.
Right.
And
Okay.
and
Great.
that's what I mean by wrong. Like I think I think if you don't do this, you can fail miserably and it hurts.
Or you can win and suffer and it hurts.
Sure, sure. I'll give you that.
That like yeah, yeah. No, that's like I love that. Like you have to be awake to open yourself up to the greatest possibilities.
Mm.
You have to be awake. You have to open yourself up. I would agree with that. Not talking about right or wrong. I'll just say I agree with that.
But also in the spirit of like doing a couple of episodes around this topic, like culture is a great one. You know, people talk about, oh, how do we build a culture? Like what are our key values, and do we spray paint that on the wall and then just tell people like this is who we are, and if and then just expect magic to happen. It's like, give me a break. Give me a break. Like that will never work. Show me an example where that's ever worked, and I'll show you a bunch of liars. It's never worked. And so if you want to build a culture of high performers, of collaborators, of bold innovators, of creative mavens, like whatever your buzzwords are, like, and I'll give you a hint. Start with waking people up.
Well, and I'll go one step further, which I think you'll like. Start with waking yourself up.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so I think it's a great topic for us to play around with, and even get some guests on, because we know a few people who I think could be quite useful talking about this topic. But yeah,
Yeah, I think we should go on a I think we should go on a series of these. I think we've opened it up. I think of the like who you be. To me, it's the who you be and what you do. It's the intersection of those two things, and there's so much in it, like performance. How does performance like? Where does high performance live in the context of you know human wiring and unlocking that? Where does culture live? Where does like building great operating systems? Where does but actually that's a how, but like where do all these things and bringing in like us exploring it, but bringing people in because it's in the world of work, it's definitely one of the
but
richest opportunities.
but that's such an interesting thing you say there, mate. Because think of how many business leaders, without even realizing what they're doing, because I think they just do it because everybody else does it, talks about a high performance culture, and they often reference their favorite sports team, whether it's the
Hmm.
Springboks or um, their favorite NFL team, or their favorite athlete, and they talk about the performance culture, and then when they dig a little deeper, you see, oh well, these people had had specialists who helped them understand about human wiring, and pointed to uh, the way in which people show up, and the choices you make between stimulus and response, and so but they don't somehow translate that winning formula fully into the winning formula for the business, because the business is all about shareholder returns and execution and what, like, whatever. I don't know where that narrative comes from, or that paradigm comes from, but somehow it doesn't translate across. But they point across to it all the time, but they don't
Well, yeah,
adopt all the elements of it
and
to
and this,
emulate that.
yeah, and this is why, like, actually digging into it, because it's actually a bit like the same when it comes to um, any aspect of human wiring, and the sport one is a great one because yes, there's all of those things, but the translation, it's not a direct translation, and it's almost the translation layer that people miss. I don't think gets dug into deep enough, just on the sport one. And if you think about it, the biggest difference between sport and business is a sports person spends 95% of the time preparing to perform for 5% of the time. And we're lucky if in the world of business, people spend 1% of their time preparing to perform, because they spend 99.9% of the time they're not even performing, they're just doing. They're just doing. And they never ever give themselves the space to get into the land of, they never give themselves the space to be quiet. They never give themselves the space to explore, really explore what's on offer if we don't do that. Um, and that's I guess that's what these explorations can be in service of, would be what could that look like? Where are the examples? Um, where are the practices? A bit like when we were in New Hampshire last October, not our most recent retreat, but and then Per came out, and who was the lead farmer. And when we were sitting around the fire, and then he said, "Oh, would you mind if I tell you about a practice that we invoke here at the farm?" And every hour for 5 minutes, everyone stops and they sit and they listen, and to their breathing, and to nature and to the leaves, and then they get back to work. And to me, that's an operating model. I'm like, but it's got human wiring built into it. And I think it's getting those practical, it's bringing the real life examples of force, and like, this is what it could look like. These are the sort of examples. And then people go, what, 5 minutes every hour sitting around doing nothing? And you're like, yeah, that is what it looks like to put in the ingredients to allow people to be at their best. It can be as simple as 5 minutes every hour to sit and be quiet and listen to your breath. But as a whole company, because everyone goes, that's what we do. And on the farm, that's what they did. And it was hugely impactful for you and me and all of the founders that we had sat around that fire. And that is what I get excited about, I think, is to be able to kind of illuminate what the translation can look like for people, so they can go, oh yeah, we don't do that. No, we don't create space. Um, you know, we're just operating at,
We got too much
we're
to do.
chasing, yeah, we're still chasing down the future. And we're high performance, which means that we do X, Y, and Z. Versus now, like, if you really want to be high performance, then it could look like this. You know, uh, it- and obviously for me right now in my real world, this is not just a this is not a an intellectual exploration with no anchor. Like, it's something that's very real in my role as chief of staff at Dual. I'm actively asking myself the question, like, how, and seeing the very real realities that of the game of business, and going, oh yeah, it's so interesting, because it's so easy to just go into autopilot. As a business, it's so easy to go into autopilot and just be run by the conditioning of the world of business. Well, this is just how you do it, and it's like, I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that's true. but it requires practice, and it requires discipline, and all of those things equate to freedom, and from there anything is possible. Um, but if you don't know, you don't know. And I see one of our roles here is to go on the explorations, not to find the answers, but to illuminate the possibilities. And I think this is going to be a fun series,
Well, we
for
should
us to
we
look
should get
into.
Sam on the podcast, because he said a really interesting thing at the gathering this last 48 hours, where he was like, one of the things that I want to maintain as part of our DNA in this business is irreverence, because I think when we're irreverent, we don't take ourselves too seriously, and then we do get curious about how we could do this differently and how we can innovate and do some leapfrogging. And so, yeah, I think he would be a great person
Well,
to
let's
have on
yeah,
as a
let's
guest.
get them on.
Yeah.
Yeah, because irreverence is a gateway to just coming back home. Because if you are like, that's one of to finish with one of Pete's pieces. Like one of the things he was great at was cracking like terrible jokes at terrible times in one regards, but they were the perfect antidote for seriousness and getting overly wound up about things and bringing everyone back into like a space where they could go on exploration. So it's interesting to find those gateways. Um, so let's do that, and let's see what emerges. But let's put a bow on this one for now, because I feel like we've kind of set the table for an exploration, put some things for us and the listeners to ponder as to how we blend these two seemingly opposing or different aspects together, whereas actually it's all the same thing. But what would be, if you do you have a bumper sticker that you would put a stick on this episode?
I got two.
Okay, go
Uh,
for it.
Discipline equals freedom,
Hmm.
and slip into your silliness.
Cool. Well, I'm not going to try and beat either of those. I've got like something washing around inside my brain, but I think I'm going to save it for when we get into that. But I like that. Slip into our silliness. There's a nice paradox in both of those as well. Like slip into your silliness, but discipline equals freedom. And it's like, yep, to both. And that in a nutshell is to me, it's like the power of and. It's just, yes, it's both of those two things. And it doesn't look that that's necessarily possible. And therefore, people are very likely to dismiss one or the other and be like, yeah, no, I park silliness because I put all my faith in discipline. Or I put all my faith in silliness and I dismiss discipline. And Pete's ears are probably burning, but, Pete's probably a good example of like silliness and discipline. Which is kind of cool. We'll have to make sure and see if we can drag him on here at some point. Um, all right, mate. Well, look, this has been cool. I hope if for anybody listening and watching that you've enjoyed our meandering and kind of are up for coming on this exploration over the coming weeks. But until we're with you again, go forth and slip into your silliness.